Enlil stood alone in the command chamber, the projection of the human settlements spreading across the surface of the earth before him, like a living pattern that refused to stay still. The lights marking their villages grew denser with each passing cycle, and the movement between them flowed faster than before. A slow breath moved through him as a decision formed. Enlil turned sharply toward the entrance and called for the remaining Igigi to be summoned. His voice carried through the chamber with firm authority as he declared, "Bring them to me, all who remain on the earth." Moments later, the Igigi gathered in the central hall. They stood in lines beneath the high ceiling, their armor reflecting the cold light from above. They had left the mines behind, yet the weight of long labor still lived in the way they held their bodies. Enlil stepped forward, his gaze moving across them one by one before he spoke. His voice remained calm, but it carried control in every word as he said, "Your role changes from this moment forward. And don't worry, you won't dig beneath the earth again." A subtle shift moved through the formation. One of the Igigi commanders stepped forward, his tone careful but edged with curiosity, and he asked, "Then what is required of us now?" Enlil's eyes remained steady as he replied, "You will watch." The word settled over them. Enlil began to move slowly across the hall, passing between their ranks while the sound of his steps filled the space. He looked over them one by one and said in a steady voice, "The humans grow beyond simple labor. They build. They learn new things every day. They begin to connect." He paused for a moment, then continued, "From this moment forward, you are watchers. That is how you will call each other from now on. And that is the role you carry." And so the Igigi took on a new role. They were no longer Igigi, they were watchers, and although they had been confused at first, they were relieved, even pleased, that they would not be returning to the mines. Then Enlil turned slightly and added, "You will observe their movements, their patterns, their growth. Every change will pass through your sight." He stopped at the center of the hall and faced them again. His gaze rested on the one who stood closest as he said, "Their development remains under control. That is your responsibility." One of the watchers stepped forward, lifting his head as he asked, "Then we guide their work and shape what they become." Enlil looked directly at him and replied, "You do not guide them. You do not shape them." He took a slow step closer and continued, "You just watch and bring every change to me." The hall fell into silence. Enlil let that silence stretch, then he spoke again. "You will not speak to them. You will not stand among them. Their path remains their own." The same commander hesitated for a moment, then asked quietly, "And if they move beyond what we expect?" Enlil moved forward, closing the distance between them, and he answered, "Then I decide what follows." After those words, silence settled across the hall, as none of them dared to speak. Enlil raised his hand as if to end the gathering, but then he stopped and looked back at them. "And one more thing before you leave," he said. The watchers focused on him at once. Enlil walked slowly past them again and spoke as he moved. "You will not speak to each other in their presence." He came to a stop and looked toward the distant exit of the hall before he continued, "That is your purpose now. You stand above them, but you remain outside their world." And just like that, across the land, the Watchers took their positions above the human settlements. They moved along high ridges, stood at the edges of growing villages, and followed the long paths that connected one place to another. From those heights, every movement below unfolded clearly before their eyes. The weight of the mines had fallen away, replaced by open sky and distance from the dust below. They walked above the work now, watching instead of digging. One Watcher stood at the edge of a ridge, looking down at a village that had grown larger with each passing cycle, and he said, "We stand above them now. This place fits us better." Another Watcher stepped beside him, his gaze moving across the same scene as he replied, "The burden has shifted. We oversee what once controlled us." The thought moved quietly between them. They began to settle into their roles, moving from one position to another, following the flow of human activity. They watched the workers leave at dawn and return at night. They tracked the way humans worked together, how they solved problems, and how they built structures that stood stronger than before. At first, the task held their attention, but as time went on, the role of the Watchers was no longer enough. They grew bored of simply observing others just to report back to Enlil. One day, a Watcher stood above a narrow valley, watching the same group of workers move along a familiar path, and after a long silence, he thought to himself, "They repeat what they have already learned. Why must I watch the same thing for years just to notice a single change?" And although more and more Watchers began to feel this way over time, nothing changed. Until one evening, as the light of the sun lowered across the land, a small group of Watchers gathered near a rocky outcrop that overlooked several connected villages. The humans below moved between fires and shelters. No one noticed them. One of the Watchers leaned forward slightly, his eyes following the movement below as he said, "I know Enlil forbade us from communicating, but this is meaningless. They grow, and we record it. Yet nothing changes in what we are allowed to do." Another Watcher turned toward him, his expression tightening as he replied, "The command remains the same. We have no other choice." The first Watcher shifted his weight, his gaze still fixed on the settlement as he said, "Then what place do we hold within this system?" A third Watcher stepped closer and, lowering his voice to ensure only the others could hear him, said, "Remember what happened the last time we rebelled. Enlil created a working class to replace us. Perhaps if we do the same now, they will create something to take our place. And if not, we will demand to return to Nibiru." And so, in secret, the Watchers agreed to go to Enlil once again, unaware that this time, Enlil would not be in the mood for any kind of negotiation. A group of Watchers moved toward the central command structure, their steps firm as they crossed the stone platform and entered the chamber where Enlil stood above the glowing projections. The patterns of human movement shifted across the display, but their presence pulled his attention before he turned. The leading Watcher stepped forward, his posture controlled as he spoke. "We have carried out the role you assigned. We have watched them, and we have reported every change." Enlil remained still for a moment, then turned his head slightly and said, "Continue." The Watcher lifted his head and went on, "We stand above them, yet we do nothing beyond that. We ask for more. Let us direct their work." Enlil's gaze settled on him fully now, and he answered, "You were not placed there to direct anything." The Watcher took a step closer, the tension rising in his voice as he said, "Then allow us to speak among ourselves. We remain in silence while the cycles repeat. The task holds no change." Enlil's expression shifted as he turned toward them completely, and he said, "Your silence is part of your purpose." A second Watcher moved forward, his tone pressing harder now as he spoke. "Then release us from it. Send us back to Nibiru. The work here stands without us." The chamber grew heavier as the words settled. Enlil stepped down from his position, closing the distance between them as his presence filled the space, and he said, "You ask to return, as if you hold that right." The first Watcher held his ground and answered, "We served in the mines. Now we stand above the work, yet nothing has changed for us." Enlil stopped in front of him, his gaze fixed and unyielding as he replied, "Everything has changed. You remain because I placed you here." The Watcher's hands tightened at his sides as he spoke again. "Then we stand here without purpose." Enlil's voice lowered, but the weight behind it pressed harder than before as he said, "You stand exactly where you are needed." The first Watcher drew a breath and said, "And if we refuse it?" For a brief moment, the chamber held still. Enlil took a slow step forward, his voice calm, but carrying something far heavier now as he replied, "Then you remove yourselves from both this world and the one you ask to return to." The meaning settled clearly among them. He continued, his eyes locked on them as he said, "You are not required beyond the role you hold. Not on Earth, not on Nibiru." Enlil stepped back slightly, then raised his hand as if closing the matter, and he said, "I trust I have made this clear." He turned away from them, his attention already returning to the projections as he said, "From this moment forward, you will carry out your role as it was given." He paused briefly, then added, "Each of you will be placed in a different part of this world. You will not see one another, and you will not gather again. Distance will keep your minds where they belong. You will follow this order fully, and you will not allow new ideas to take shape." After that command, the Watchers spread across the land, each one placed far from the others, standing alone above distant settlements where no familiar presence remained. Days turned into cycles, and the silence around them began to grow heavier. Without the others beside them, the space around them stretched wider, and the task that once felt simple began to press differently with each passing day. Enlil believed the distance would bring control, but that distance made them start wanting to connect with humans. One Watcher stood above a riverbank, where the village gathered at the end of each day. His gaze followed the people as they moved freely, their voices rising into the open air as they laughed, spoke, and rested after the work was done. He remained still, watching longer than before, as the rhythm of their lives unfolded without restraint. They move without command. They choose what to do with their time, the Watcher thought to himself. And slowly that difference began to draw him in. Across the land, others felt the same shift. They no longer watched only for patterns and reports. Their attention lingered on details that had once passed unnoticed. And among all of it, one thing held their gaze longer than anything else: the women. One watcher stood above a narrow path that led toward the river, watching as a young woman walked alone, carrying cloth in her hands. Her steps were steady and calm as she knelt beside the water and began to wash each piece slowly. The watcher remained still, his eyes following the way her hands moved through the current, the way her hair shifted with the wind. Another watcher, far from him, watched a different scene unfold near the center of a settlement. A group of women sat together, their hands working through long strands of hair, weaving them into patterns that took shape with each movement. The distance between the watchers remained, but the longer they watched, the more they wanted to get closer. Day by day, they found themselves thinking about the human women and their soft voices. They wanted a part of that for themselves. And then, slowly, the distance between watching and stepping closer began to shrink. One night, as the fires burned low and most of the settlement had gone quiet, a watcher moved from his position and descended toward the edge of a village. His steps were careful, measured as he approached the river where the same woman returned each night. She knelt near the water again, her hands moving through the cloth as the surface reflected the light of the moon. The watcher stepped closer. The sound of his movement reached her. She turned, and for a moment, they faced each other in silence. The watcher held his position, expecting her to pull away, yet she remained where she stood, her gaze steady as she studied him. After a few minutes of silence, the watcher decided to speak first. Uncertain, with a trembling voice, he said, "You stand here alone." The woman looked at him without stepping back and replied, "And yet you came closer." The watcher paused, then said, "I have watched you for a long time." She tilted her head slightly and answered, "Then you already know I return here each night." He remained still, then replied, "I know more than that." The moment stretched between them before he stepped back into the darkness, leaving her standing by the river as if nothing had changed. But something had. Elsewhere, another watcher moved through a narrow path between shelters as the village settled into sleep. A young woman stepped outside, carrying a small bowl in her hands. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes fixed on his form. She studied him for a long moment before saying, "You do not move like the others." He took a step closer and said, "Because I am not like them." She held his gaze and answered, "Then why do you come here?" The watcher paused before replying, "Because I wanted to speak with you." Across the land, more moments like this began to unfold. Each one remained hidden, and each one happened where no one else could see. And over time, those hidden moments stopped feeling like something small. The distance that once existed between the watchers and the humans slowly disappeared, replaced by nights that grew longer and meetings that no longer ended quickly. The watchers no longer waited for night. They no longer limited their steps to the edges of the settlements. They moved among the paths, between the shelters, closer to the lives they had once only observed from above. And with each step, the line that once separated them faded. Days passed, and then more followed. What began as quiet conversations became something they no longer tried to hide from themselves. The watchers returned to the same women again and again, Some stood beside them by the rivers. Others walked with them through the fields. Some entered their homes when the fires burned low, and the rest of the village had already fallen into sleep. And over time, one bond was no longer enough. One watcher stood near the edge of a forest, speaking to a woman whose voice carried softly through the trees. When she turned away, another approached him later that same night, and he did not step back. He spoke to both, and he returned to both. The role he had once carried no longer held weight. Across the land, the watchers gave themselves fully to those moments. They followed the women, waited for them, returned to them, choosing their presence over everything they had been commanded to protect. And with each passing cycle, the memory of Enlil's words faded further into the distance. One watcher stood near a small fire as a woman sat beside him, her hand resting against his arm. He looked down at her and said quietly, "I was placed here to watch over you." She looked up at him and answered, "Then why do you stay when you could leave?" The watcher held her gaze and replied, "Because I choose to remain." And because of that choice, everything changed. A few months later, one woman walked through the village with her hand resting longer against her body. Another paused more often, her steps heavier than before. A third sat near the edge of a field, her breathing slower as she looked down at herself in quiet confusion. The women began to speak among themselves. One stood near the river and said softly, "Something grows inside me." Another looked at her and replied, "I feel the same." Their voices carried low, uncertain, as they tried to understand what was happening. Above them, the watchers saw everything. They knew that they had crossed a line. They knew that when those children were born, they would not be like ordinary newborns, and that it would be the moment Enlil discovered everything that had been happening. Deep down, they knew he would react. He was already angered that none of his attempts to reduce the human population had succeeded, and this would be too much for him. This would be the final spark that set everything ablaze, and they had no idea just how right they were. Yet despite knowing all of this, their sense of morality had eroded so much over time that not a single one of them stepped away. They continued meeting in secret with the human women, and then the day came when the first child of the forbidden union was born. Inside a shelter, a woman lay surrounded by others who moved around her with steady hands, guiding her through each moment as her breath grew heavier and her body strained with the effort. Outside, a watcher stood near the entrance, his body still but his attention fixed on every sound that came from within. His hands remained at his sides, yet the tension moved through him as each cry grew louder. He spoke quietly, almost to himself, as he said, "This cannot be undone." His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp cry coming from inside the shelter. Moments later, one of the women stepped outside, holding the newborn in her arms. The child's body already carried a size that did not belong to a newborn. Its limbs moved with strength that pressed against the woman's grip. Its presence filled the space around it in a way that drew every eye. The woman looked at the child and said, "He grows even now." Days passed, and more children followed. But each birth carried the same pattern. Their bodies grew faster than the others. Their strength showed early, even in the way they moved, the way they stood, the way they reached for anything placed in front of them. And with that growth came something else. One child stood near the center of a settlement, his size already surpassing those around him as he reached toward a basket of food. His hand closed around it, pulling it toward himself as he ate without pause. A man stepped forward, his voice rising as he said, "That was meant for all of us." But the child did not respond. He just reached for more. Another stood near a field, his steps heavy as he moved through the crops, crushing what stood beneath him without noticing the damage left behind. One man looked at the others and said, "They take more than they need." And he was right. The giants who had been born were greedy for human food, in the same way the Watchers had been greedy for human women. They consumed more than the land could give. They took what they wanted without hesitation. But that was not the greatest problem that had begun to emerge. At first, the damage appeared in small places. A storage pit stood open one morning, its contents gone. The grain that had been carefully collected over many days had disappeared in a single night. Nearby, a group of men argued in low voices, trying to understand what had happened. One of them pointed toward the edge of the settlement and said, "It was one of them." By the next cycle, more supplies vanished. The animals grew restless, driven away from the fields by heavy steps that shook the ground. Fences broke under pressure that no human could match. What had once been protected began to disappear piece by piece. Then the destruction grew visible. One giant moved through a row of shelters, his body forcing its way through the narrow space. The structure beside him cracked as his shoulder brushed against it. Wood snapped, and clay walls split and collapsed into dust. The people inside rushed out, pulling children with them as the shelter gave way. A woman stood outside, holding her child tightly as she looked at the broken remains of her home and said, "We built this with our hands." Another woman stepped beside her and replied, "And they destroyed without seeing it." Across the settlement, the same scene unfolded again and again. The giants moved without measure. Their steps carried weight that the land could not hold. Their hands reached for whatever stood closest, whether it belonged to them or not. And with each movement, more of the village fell apart. The people began to gather in groups. They stayed close together. They were afraid, and for the first time in a long while, they didn't know what to do. The giants were far stronger, and there was nothing left but to move away from them. One man stood at the center of a small group and said, "We cannot stay here." The fear spread quickly. Fires burned longer through the night. Voices dropped lower as the sense of safety disappeared from every part of their lives. And slowly, the work began to stop. At first, a few workers failed to appear at the mines. The next morning, more were missing. Then entire groups did not return. The paths that once carried long lines of workers toward the Abzu stood empty. Tools lay where they had been left. The entrances to the mines remained open, yet no one stepped inside. A man stood at the edge of the path leading toward the mine and said, "We cannot leave our families unguarded." Another looked back toward the settlement and replied, "If we go, we return to nothing." And before Enlil could even react, the systems that had once moved without interruption slowed, then stopped entirely. For the first time since the creation of mankind, there was no control over the earth. And the only reason for that were those who were meant to ensure that order would never disappear. After all that time, the Watchers stood together, looking at the destruction they had caused. One of them spoke, his voice filled with regret. This was never meant to happen. But even as he said it, he knew it was too late, and that regret would bring nothing. Another stood beside him and answered, "We brought this into their world. Our desires led to total collapse." And he was right. The balance between control and labor had collapsed under the weight of what had been unleashed. Humans had been created to work, yet none of them worked anymore. Nibiru was once again in danger of running out of gold, all while the giants continued to grow and destroy everything in their path. Enlil saw what was happening, and this time he wasn't even angry, only disappointed. He knew he had to start again, and he was ready for the next step. What came next would change the planet Earth forever.